For more than 50 years, nobody's gone back to the moon. Now, 4 astronauts just blasted off inside a spacecraft that's never carried humans before, and this mission decides whether our whole moon comeback is actually real. Here's everything you need to know about the Artemis II launch that just happened. On April 1st, 2026, Artemis II finally lifted off from Kennedy Space Center, and the second that rocket cleared the pad, the entire vibe of modern spaceflight changed. For years, the moon has felt like this giant old achievement we keep replaying in documentaries. Apollo happened, the photos became legendary, the names became immortal, and then for more than half a century, nobody went back. The moon turned into memory. Artemis II just turned it back into a destination. And that's why this launch hits so hard. Because this isn't just another cool rocket video. It isn't just one more NASA broadcast with dramatic music, countdown voices, and social media clips. This is the first crewed mission to the moon's vicinity since Apollo 17 in 1972. That gap is so absurdly long that whole generations grew up thinking human lunar missions belonged to another era, like moonshots were something your grandparents watched on grainy television. Then Artemis II shows up and says, no, this story's not over. But here's the thing. The launch was never the whole story. Honestly, the launch might be the easiest part to understand. Big rocket, giant fireball, 4 astronauts, history made. Clean, cinematic, everyone claps. But the actual mission starts after the cheering ends, and that's where Artemis II gets way more intense. Because once Orion got into space, deployed its solar array wings, and started flying on its own, the crew immediately had to begin proving that this spacecraft can really do what NASA's been promising for years. Not in theory, not in a simulation, not in an uncrewed test with actual human beings inside it, and that changes everything. Artemis I already sent Orion around the moon in 2022 without a crew. That was important, but it was still just hardware proving it could survive the trip. Artemis II is different. This time, 4 people are inside that machine, breathing its air, relying on its systems, sleeping in its cabin, eating its food, and trusting it with their lives while it goes farther from Earth than any humans have gone in generations. That's not a software check anymore. That's commitment. So while people on Earth were still posting launch clips and saying this looked insane, inside Orion, the mood had already shifted into test mode. The crew had to start checking life support, communications, flight controls, temperature, power, and the whole personality of the spacecraft itself. And that's really what Orion has on this mission, a personality. Because machines always do once humans get trapped inside them long enough. Suddenly you find out whether it's calm or annoying, clean or messy, smooth or weirdly stubborn. And Artemis II started showing its quirks almost immediately. There was a brief communications issue. The cabin was cold. The only toilet on board had a problem. The crew had to sleep in short blocks and start adapting to zero gravity, while mission control kept them on an insanely strict schedule. That is not glamorous space poster stuff. That is real space flight. That is exactly the kind of detail that makes this mission feel more legit, not less. Because if you're actually going back to the moon, it's not just about giant speeches and beautiful views. It's about whether the toilet works when you're trapped in a capsule for 10 days. And weirdly, that's why this mission feels alive. It's not polished. It's not this perfect science fiction future where everything works and humanity glides gracefully into the stars. It's awkward, high pressure, cramped, human, and kind of chaotic, which is exactly what makes it exciting. These astronauts aren't floating around on a luxury deep space cruise. They're living inside a spacecraft about the size of a minibus, dealing with cold air, blowing through the cabin, checking systems, fixing problems, and preparing for the moment when Earth stops feeling close. And that moment matters way more than people think. Because Artemis II doesn't just go straight to the moon the second it launches. First, Orion moves into a high Earth orbit so the crew can test the spacecraft before committing to deep space. That pause is not an accident. NASA wants time to stress this thing, check how it behaves, and make sure nobody's heading toward the moon inside a machine that's already acting sketchy. That makes this mission feel cautious, but it also makes it feel serious. Artemis II isn't trying to look cool, it's trying to come home, and honestly, that's what gives the whole mission, it's tension. If enough things look wrong, you don't continue, you don't get sentimental and push through because the moment's historic. You stop, you stay in orbit, you abort the bigger dream. So every test matters. Every conversation with mission control matters. Every burn matters. Every little weird system issue suddenly feels connected to the giant question hanging over the whole program. Can NASA actually pull this off again? That question gets even bigger when you look at the mission profile. Artemis II is not landing on the moon. That's a huge detail because a lot of people hear moon mission and instantly picture boots in the dust. Not this time. This flight is built around a free return path. Orion heads out toward the moon, swings around it, and uses lunar gravity to help bend its trajectory back toward Earth. It's elegant, old school, and brutally practical. You get the deep space distance, you get the radiation environment, you get the crude systems test, you get the lunar flyby, and if all goes well, you also get a path home that doesn't depend on some wildly complicated landing sequence. But even getting onto that path takes work. One of the early big steps is the perigee rays burn, which sounds dry until you realize it's part of the setup for the real move, the translunar injection burn. That's the moment when Orion gets the big push it needs to stop just being a spacecraft around Earth and start becoming a spacecraft leaving Earth. And that shift is where this mission becomes emotionally wild. Because high Earth orbit is still orbit, it still feels like you're near home. Translunar injection is different. That's when Earth starts becoming the place behind you. And that is such a crazy sentence to say in 2026. Human beings are leaving Earth for the moon. Again. Not someday, not after another concept animation, not once a new render drops online, right now, on this mission, in this spacecraft. 4 people are literally doing the thing that most of humanity has only ever watched in old archive footage. And Orion is not being babied through that process either. One of the most underrated parts of Artemis II is that the crew also has to manually handle proximity operations after separating from the upper stage. That means actual piloting work in space, not just sitting there while automation does everything. Victor Glover and the crew have to help guide the spacecraft during a close approach demonstration that matters for future docking operations. That's huge. This isn't just a passive ride, it's a live test of human judgment inside a brand new, crude deep space vehicle. NASA is not just testing if Orion can move, it's testing whether Orion and its crew can work together, and that's where the mission starts to feel less like nostalgia and more like training for an entirely new era. Because Artemis II is really about what comes next. Every part of it points forward. The life support checks point forward. The burn sequence points forward. The crew schedule points forward. The manual piloting points forward. The small failures point forward too. Cold cabin, toilet drama, sleep adaptation, all of that matters because NASA needs to know what annoys people, what distracts them, what needs redesign, what works better than expected, and what absolutely cannot break on later missions. That's the thing about this flight. It's not trying to be perfect, it's trying to be useful, and if it keeps clearing milestones, the payoff gets massive fast. By around day 6, Orion is expected to swing around the far side of the moon. Not the familiar face we see from Earth, the other side, the one that's always carried this weird hidden energy, because we never naturally get to look at it from home. The crew is expected to spend hours in that lunar flyby phase, making observations, taking images, and seeing parts of the moon no human has ever seen with their own eyes in quite this way. That alone is already amazing, but then you get to the numbers. At maximum distance, Artemis II could carry its crew farther from Earth than any humans have ever gone, breaking the Apollo 13 record. Just pause there for a second. The farthest human beings have ever been from Earth is still an Apollo-era record. That's how little we've done beyond low Earth orbit since the 1970s. Artemis II might finally break that, and that is not symbolic. That is physical. That is measurable. That is 4 people becoming the most distant human beings in history, while the rest of us watch from a planet that suddenly looks very, very far away. So if anyone still thinks this mission is just a PR comeback, no. This is real distance. real exposure, real risk, real deep space. And the moon itself isn't just a backdrop here either. Scientists still don't fully understand why the moon's near side and far side are so different. The moon is weirdly lopsided. The visible side and hidden side don't line up neatly in geology, crust thickness, and surface history. Artemis II is not carrying out some giant Apollo-style landing science package, but astronaut eyes still matter. Human observers looking directly at terrain, lighting, and surface texture during a live flyby can notice things that help guide future missions, especially as NASA keeps aiming toward the lunar South Pole for later exploration. So now the mission becomes more than survival. Now it's also about seeing, not just reaching the moon, but learning how to approach it again with humans in the loop. And the farther you follow that idea, the bigger Artemis II gets, because this isn't just about one flight around the moon. This is the first crude proof that the whole Artemis architecture might actually work, that later missions might dock, that astronauts might head down to the surface again, that you could eventually get not just visits, but presence. And that future is much messier than people realize. Apollo was basically one country throwing everything it had at a singular goal. Artemis is different. Now you've got NASA, Canada, Europe, private companies, lander plans, docking plans, surface systems, political pressure, budget fights, international partnerships, and the quiet background pressure of other nations also pushing toward the moon. This is not one clean, heroic sprint. It's an ecosystem. A messy one, a strategic one, and a very expensive one. Artemis II is the first crude moment where that ecosystem has to prove it can move. That's part of why the crew matters so much too. Reed Wiseman is the commander, the calm center. Victor Glover is set to become the first black astronaut on a lunar mission. Christina Koch becomes the first woman on a lunar mission. Jeremy Hansen becomes the first non-American and the first Canadian to fly around the moon. And that changes the image of deep space in a very real way. Apollo gave humanity one picture of who goes to the moon. Artemis is trying to replace that with a bigger one. Jeremy Hansen especially brings in the emotional side of all this. His family talked about the nerves and the fear of knowing someone you love is heading that far away in a mission where the risk is completely real. And that's the part space coverage sometimes smooths over too neatly. These astronauts aren't just symbols. They're people with families, routines, stress, keepsakes, and loved ones. Watching them ride an enormous controlled explosion away from Earth. When you remember that, the launch stops feeling abstract and starts feeling personal. And that human feeling is all over the mission. They've got tailored menus, freeze-dried food, drinks ration per day, a carry-on suitcase-sized exercise device, short sleep windows, hanging sleeping setups, and a schedule so strict it makes normal life look like chaos. There's no roomy sci-fi comfort here. This is 4 people living in a tight metal environment, trying to stay sharp while the spacecraft becomes their entire world. 1 minute, they're dealing with cabin airflow. The next, they're preparing for a burn that decides whether they leave Earth orbit. That contrast is what makes spaceflight so insane. Cosmic stakes, tiny details. Even the hardware feels like a weird perfect symbol for where space is right now. SLS is powerful, but it's also built from legacy ideas and shuttle era DNA. Orion is new, but it rides on this stack that carries echoes of older American programs. Europe provides the service module. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and others all play roles. This is not some sleek one-company miracle ship from a billionaire fantasy. It's a coalition machine built from compromises, government pressure, old systems, new ambitions, and international cooperation. And honestly, that may be exactly what makes it believable. Artemis doesn't look like science fiction. It looks like reality, trying very hard to become the future. And once you zoom out one more step, you realize Artemis II isn't even really just about the moon. It's about Mars, too. Because if you can't keep a crew alive and functioning on a 10-day lunar flyby, you're nowhere near ready for a Mars mission. If you can't manage life support, crew performance, radiation monitoring, deep space communications, manual spacecraft operations, re-entry stress, and all the little human factors that pile up inside a spacecraft, then Mars is still just a cool concept art folder. Artemis II is the exam before the harder exam. It's the mission where humanity proves whether it's actually serious about living beyond Earth orbit again. So what happens if this all works? Then Artemis II becomes one of those hinge missions people look back on and realize changed everything. Maybe it won't have the single iconic image that Apollo 11 had. Maybe it won't get mythologized in exactly the same way, but it could become the flight that reopened the road, the one that made the moon feel reachable again, the one that proved deep space human flight wasn't trapped in the 20th century, the one that let later crews say, okay, now we go lower, now we dock, now we land, now we stay, and if something goes wrong, that matters just as much. That's the shadow under the entire mission. If Orion struggles badly, if crucial systems look weak, if procedures expose bigger risks than expected, the whole Artemis timeline gets shakier. That's why every little issue feels louder than usual. A toilet issue sounds funny until you remember the crew's living in that capsule for about 10 days. A cold cabin sounds minor until fatigue and discomfort start affecting performance. A 6-minute burn sounds short until you realize it determines whether 4 people head toward the moon or stay near Earth. That's what spaceflight does. It turns tiny details into giant consequences, and maybe that's why the launch felt emotional in a way that went beyond spectacle. It wasn't just relief, it was release. Years of delays, technical worries, schedule slips, leak fears, heat shield questions, political pressure, and public doubt were all sitting under that rocket when it launched, and for one moment, all of it turned into motion. The moon stopped being a delayed plan and became a live mission again. So when you think about Artemis II, don't just picture the rocket leaving the pad. Think of the whole chain. The possibility of becoming the most distant human beings in history, the return through Earth's atmosphere, and behind all of that, one giant question. Can we actually do this again and this time mean it? Artemis II is trying to answer yes. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe for more insane stories from outer space.